right, let's keep the conversation rolling and welcome in Mike McIntyre from the Winnipeg Free Press. Mike, how are you today? What's going on?
Hey, Huss. Doing pretty well, thanks. All is well in the world, and lots of anticipation of the hottest free agent out there on the market right now in Barry Trotz. Yeah, a lot of excitement, a lot of nervous anticipation among Jets Nation of what might be to come, and guess we'll see how things play out here in the coming days and weeks.
Most members of the media, anyone that covers the Winnipeg Jets, who has discussed at length, wrote about, talked about what has plagued this team, certainly this season, and depending on who you believe and where you're at, dating back a number of years, realizes that there is a ton of work. There's a lot of talent on this roster,
right?
But this was so far from a cohesive team in so many ways. And I mean, the Barry Trotz, the fact that he was born in Winnipeg, coached at the U of M, grew up in Dauphin Kings, all these Manitoba roots. I mean,
he's got a street named after him up there, Huss.
Well, he does. And you know what? I mean, listen, that counts and that matters. And all in all, I mean, as I've been saying, I mean, this is probably way more than the Winnipeg Jets were considering when it would come to getting their new coach. But considering the needs, the problems in the organization right now, and what signing Barry Trotz could do, both on the ice, off the ice, in the community, and make no mistake about it, the business aspect, the regaining the confidence of the fans, and how much that would take place the second that Barry Trotz is introduced, to me makes this, as far as a business decision, something that they need to be very aggressive on. But I mean, first of all, take us back to yesterday. What did you think when you heard that he was fired? And from your perspective, how big of a home run, if they could be aggressive and make it happen, would be getting Barry Trotz here, considering what's happened to this team since they went to the conference finals 4 or 5 years ago?
Well, my immediate reaction was that Lou Lamoriello had lost his bloody mind, and he didn't. He didn't make me think any different when I saw his news conference, and he was sort of pressed a little bit on why he made this decision, and he really seemed to struggle to give any kind of reason that made any kind of sense. I mean, to suggest that he felt the players needed a new voice, but then in the same breath to admit that he didn't consult with any of the players, that's an interesting way to approach your team. And I gotta wonder, I'd love to be a fly on the wall on the group chat of a lot of New York Islanders players today, because for all the things you just listed off, Huss, about the message that it would send in this community to bring a guy like Barry Trotz on board, I gotta wonder what the message being sent within the New York Islanders community and within the team is regarding their kind of immediate future. Dial it back a year, the Islanders, we got another Piper appearance here, by the way.
Come on in, Piper. You're always welcome.
I mean, they were coming off back-to-back Eastern Conference final appearances against a superior Tampa team on paper that the Islanders gave the Lightning everything they could handle with, a much lesser roster. And a big part of that is what Barry Trotz was able to get out of that group. They got a brand new building, like excitement you'd think around the Islanders was at an all-time high. Well, my goodness, can things change in a hurry? They obviously had a very disappointing season. Part of that was building related, that they had to play 13 straight on the road to start the year, which was a murderous schedule. And as we know, Huss, I mean, the Eastern Conference, there were 8 teams that really established themselves quite early as dominant teams, and they separated themselves from the pack. And so I don't hold this against Barry Trotz that, they had to play 13 on the road. They get ravaged by COVID. And this was before the NHL, pulled the chute on, that extended Christmas break and shut some teams down. Like, the Islanders were forced to play through all that. They basically fielded an AHL roster for a couple weeks. This is after 13 straight on the road, and they just could never catch up. And to their credit, they didn't quit. I mean, they were one of the best teams in the NHL in kind of the second half of the season. Like, and you could argue they knew they weren't making the playoffs, and Barry Trotz still found a way to really get that group, motivated. And I think it just speaks to what he's been able to do historically with lesser talented teams. And so to translate it to a Winnipeg situation, the Winnipeg Jets roster, I wouldn't trade it in a second with the Islanders roster. Winnipeg's roster is far more talented than what the Islanders have as a whole. And so if you're Barry Trotz, I mean, in addition to the hometown connection and the heartwarming kind of story that would be, I got to think if he's surveying the NHL landscape about a team that he could potentially come into, and with a few tweaks here and there, maybe a few additions to the roster and some systematic changes and getting everybody to buy in, I got to think Barry, he's a smart guy. He would look at this Jets roster and say, I think I could do some pretty special teams with this group. And so, for all the Seattles that I've heard, like in terms of possible landing spots for Barry Trotz, even Vegas to an extent, Vegas is in cap hell. Like they're going to have to make some really tough roster decisions. If you're Barry Trotz, just in terms of a fit, a hockey fit, forget about the personal connection, the Jets would have to be a pretty appealing spot. And, if you're True North, and I wrote this in my piece today, I jokingly said, send him a blank check. But I mean, that's how True North has to approach us, in my opinion. There is so much at stake. And as you say, it's not just the on-ice product. The message this would send to the fan base to kind of re-energize the market after a really tough few seasons, in this market, a lot of it not their fault. But this past season felt like a significant step back. And that's not my words. That's a lot of players, including the captain, who talked about that. Getting Barry Trotz on board would feel like a major step forward and would put the Jets, I think, back on the front burner for a lot of fans. And I don't know that you can even measure the value of that. Certainly in a year where they couldn't sell out any games and they're going to be pushing hard to get season ticket renewals and all that going forward. Having Barry Trotz as the new face of your franchise would be a hell of a sales tactic.
No, there's no doubt about it, Mike. And I mean, we've seen it, here on Winnipeg Sports Talk. I'm sure you've felt it, with your pieces in the Winnipeg Free Press and just on social media that, over the course of the second half of this season, certainly there was anger with where the club was, but then there was some apathy. Like there were some people that were sort of checking out. Now, I think it was frankly somewhat depressing for people that care so much about the team to see a team with this much talent, floundering where they were and going in the direction that they were and finishing it out. The second the season ended, and maybe it was because some of the more salacious things that came out of what we were hearing from the players, and then of course Mark Scheifele's infamous year-end exit meeting, if you will, with the media before he'd met with Kevin Cheveldayoff. People are back. Like the people that said, listen, I just can't watch, this is too much for me, they're right back, because I think that it's obvious that there is a ton of passion. People care about this team, but they also aren't dumb, and they've been watching it and has seen what's happened a little while. And whether, there's some things people have heard, there's some things people have reported, it's quite clear that there's a lot of things that have been broken within this organization. And Barry Trotz ticks every single box when it comes in to be arguably the best possible guy to help what the hockey operations needs. Yeah. And I guarantee you, as someone that spent a lot of time on the other side of things, when it comes to dealing with fans, regaining the confidence of this community in the direction of the club, it would literally be turned around overnight if that happens. And I'll tell you what, that's worth a lot to a National Hockey League club.
Yeah, I don't think you can put a price on that. So as you say, True North would have to break the bank by its own standards in terms of what they would have to pay for a head coach. But I think the return on that investment would be so significant that it would be a no-brainer. And so I personally don't anticipate money being an object here. If Barry Trotz wants to come to Winnipeg, I think Barry Trotz ends up in Winnipeg, because I don't think True North would balk at a certain price tag and say, you know what, that's just too rich for our blood. We're going to have to take a pass. Because I think the flips that they recognize the message that would potentially send to the market. And I don't think they can necessarily handle the blowback that would probably come if that were the case, if they basically get outbid for Barry Trotz. And again, this is not an organization that operates on the cheap. People seem to gloss over the fact the Jets have been a cap team now for several straight seasons. In fact, they were over the cap. They were on it. They needed LTIR to get cap compliant this past year. And Kevin Cheveldayoff at his year end said that he expects that's going to continue. This is not a franchise that's cutting costs or cutting corners. And, certainly when it comes to the coach, that's the reality these days. If you want a big name, a big marketable name, you got to pay. And that might mean paying $4 or $5 million for your coach. They don't hesitate to pay that for a player, for a second or third line player, for a third pairing defenseman. Barry Trotz could come in and, as you say, check off those boxes. And to me, one of the big ones, or two big ones actually, Huss, we know that Barry Trotz teams, their attention to defensive detail is pristine. That's the area that I think everybody who watches the Jets would agree they need the most work in. Barry Trotz would, I suspect it might not be overnight, but he would overhaul the way this team defends, the way this team checks, the way this team plays in its own end, because that's a hallmark of any team he's ever coached. That being said, Barry Trotz has coached the greatest goal scorer, arguably, of this generation in Alex Ovechkin. So, and I don't think you heard Alex Ovechkin claiming that Barry Trotz suppressed his skills or didn't bring out the best in him. Alex Ovechkin won a Stanley Cup under Barry Trotz, and Barry Trotz got a guy like Ovechkin to commit to the two-way game, to become a better all-around player. So, yeah, I'm looking at you, Mark Scheifele, and what a guy like Barry Trotz could potentially do for your career. And again, just as the message it would send within the community, I think would be one of excitement and hope. I got to think within the Jets room, landing a big fish like Barry Trotz would send a similar message. And so disgruntled players, whether it's Mark Scheifele, whether it's Connor Hellebuck, who clearly was not happy with how the year ended, for all those guys and that window that we talk about that remains slightly ajar anyways, I think that window gets kicked open really wide if you bring in a guy like Barry Trotz.
Well, let me ask you something that I hit Billick with, and it just sort of came to me as we were talking about this. And we've spent a lot of time with Mark Scheifele, and I mean, I've been talking about, and really this was before maybe some of the things that look worse on Mark, especially that final, his level of commitment to the team.
Yeah.
What we heard from his teammates and, that bit at the end. But I've often been thinking, and I've started talking about this in November on this program, that with where the team is and you're looking big picture, I mean, if you're not planning on signing a 31-year-old Mark Scheifele to a big raise and a massive legacy contract, as I believe Kevin Cheveldayoff referred to some of the others before, well, then what are you doing? He's one of your best assets going forward. Now, I think it's quite clear that he's a central figure in much of the unrest within the locker room and the organization for a long time. But regardless of all of that, if you know that you are not going to be in a position at the end of 2 more years, and you don't think that right there, like that's the difference between you winning and losing a Stanley Cup. And I think right now it's hard to make that argument.
Right.
The best time to make one of those moves is right now, because you've got 2 years left on an affordable contract. I mean, as Elliot Friedman and a number of insiders said, Mark Scheifele does go to the market. The Jets are planning on trading him. There will be dozens of potential suitors.
Sure.
So given that being the case, I do ask you, Mike, would a Trotz hire in Winnipeg make Mark Scheifele's tenure, if you will, more salvageable at this point in the short term? Or at the same time, do they basically know what they have? They know what they've realized that, has been issues with this club, and utilize that trade and that piece to bring back, a package of players or talent, prospects, whatever you want, that would fit in over the course of the next little while under a Barry Trotz regime? Where are you on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, because Scheifele's certainly it would depend on the return, and you'd have to get a return that you feel could step in and at the very least cover for what you're losing in Mark Scheifele. Because don't forget, Mark Scheifele is not the only guy that only has 2 more years on his deal. There's some other important players, including your Vezina Trophy winner in net and Connor Hellebuck. He's only got 2 more years as well. Blake Wheeler obviously has 2 more years. He's not as important a player as certainly Connor Hellebuck is these days. There's also the wild card of what are you doing with Pierre-Luc Dubois? Are you getting his name this summer on a long-term deal? Are you bridging him, which would walk him into free agency, which I think would be a very dangerous move if you're the Jets, and I don't think that's one they want to make. So there's so many moving parts here. And then there's that unknown of, well, what if a guy like Barry Trotz, if they hire Barry Trotz, what if he could tap into Mark Scheifele and get him to be a player that, you know, he's a massive bargain now at that contract for what we're trying to accomplish. And if it means that we can compete for a cup in one of these next 2 years with him in the fold, is that a risk they're willing to take, that you might lose him and his return is diminished because you hold on to him too long? So it's a tough call for sure. And I think a big part of it would be, how did those exit meetings go? You know, certainly what was said between Cheveldayoff and Scheifele. Where's Mark Scheifele's head at? We know that he didn't ask for a trade per Elliot Friedman. At least he didn't flat out demand one. I think he's dropped enough hints that he wouldn't balk at a change of scenery.
I'd still love to hear that his agent didn't either. I mean,
right,
exactly. To me, that report is somewhat dubious. And to be honest, and I got tons of respect for Elliot, but I mean, we all know how this insider game works.
Yes, we do.
I have a feeling that, considering, to be perfectly honest, how bad his client looked coming out at the end of the season, yes, that may be a little bit of damage control from representatives, from some of the people that Mark had the conversations with that he talked about afterwards.
They got the fire extinguisher out for sure to try and at least reduce the flames there. But so, you know, there's a lot to consider. And I think that's why, if you're the Jets, you got to get some clarity sooner rather than later on who your head coach is. And I guess if it's not Barry Trotz, who's it going to be? And I think you then start to make decisions based on what you think that new coach is bringing. And specifically, because we know Mark Scheifele, it's been such an issue, what's the buy-in going to be from Mark Scheifele? Is a new coach potentially going to make all the problems that exist disappear? And if the answer is yes, then I think it's a risk worth taking, that you hang on to him and you try to maximize what you have with him and you try and win right now. If there's still doubt, though, as to his buy-in, as to his level of engagement and just what you're going to get, then I think you have to move him in a heartbeat. And as you say, his value will never be higher than it is right now. And sort of each game, each day that ticks off closer to when he could become a UFA, you lose a little bit of his potential return. So yeah, it's one of a number of big issues. But I think, you know, right now, obviously the Trotz decision is priority number one. And, you know, I guess a lot of this, in my eyes, the puck is kind of in Barry Trotz's end right now, right? Like he's going to control the situation. If he wants to make a decision quickly, if he wants to wait a few weeks to kind of collect his breath and maybe assess the landscape, you know, what other jobs might open up after this first round is over, or does any of that matter? If you're the Jets and if Barry Trotz wants to be here, I think you got to find a way to get this done ASAP. So we're all going to be kind of on Trotz watch here for the next few days, I would think.
Mike McIntyre joining us on Winnipeg Sports Talk Daily from the Winnipeg Free Press. If you're new here, make sure to press the red subscribe button. We're here every day, 1 o'clock Central Time on YouTube. And make sure to subscribe to the podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Should be in your feed around 3:30, just in time for your drive home. There's been plenty of speculation for a long time about the locker room in the Winnipeg Jets, the nature of the Wheeler, Scheifele, Maurice relationship, and then everybody else. And I'm sure that's a huge, you know, listen, it's another major challenge for whoever comes in to take over this club and try and get this team back together, moving together in the right direction. What did you think about what you heard from James Patrick in that clip when he was on with Laidlaw and Greshner, Mike?
Well, I wasn't entirely surprised by the content that came out. I guess I was surprised that it came out the way it did, and specifically, who it was kind of sharing the story. James Patrick, obviously, he's not the guy with 3 followers on Twitter and an egg avatar, talking about dysfunction in the locker room. He's James Patrick, the coach of arguably the number 1 junior team in the land. Oh, and a guy who very well could be an NHL coach. In fact, a guy that people, including myself, have mentioned as a potential candidate for the Jets coaching job. I got to wonder how James Patrick's comments went over in the upper offices of True North. No, I would not think they were received very well. James Patrick, obviously very well connected in the hockey world and certainly in the NHL. He's got connections to Buffalo. He's got connections to Philadelphia. That's where Kevin Hayes and Cody Eakin play. Those are the guys that he was talking about, basically sharing stories about what he's heard. There's a little bit of that element that this is like the game of telephone, Huss, where, the story gets passed along and you wonder, okay, how much of it is being exaggerated and, because you were not hearing directly from the source. That being said, as I mentioned, I'm not entirely surprised that guys like Eakin and Hayes might have, from their brief time in Winnipeg, would have left thinking, man, there's a lot of, just look at when they were here, right? Specifically when those guys were here. And it was around the time when things were not peachy keen in Jets land, right? I'll say this. I mean, different guys are going to have different experiences for sure. We know a guy like Paul Stastny, for example, he clearly, although he certainly called out some of the culture and some of what he was seeing publicly, he's a guy that we know he's twice waived a no trade to come to this team and this locker room. Is that because he has a bigger say than maybe an Eakin or a Hayes does? And, who knows? But it was very revealing for sure. And as I say, a little eyebrow raising, and I suspect it didn't play very well in the offices at True North. And, it's too bad we don't have any more availabilities with the captain or Scheifele here until training camp, because I suspect those comments are probably going to be put to those players by one of us scribes here, given the source of where they came from.
Yeah, obviously, it's something that when you hear that, it is something that is noteworthy because it's not just some dude at the end of the bar,
Sure.
saying it. It's someone that obviously has pretty strong hockey ties in Winnipeg. Obviously, he's the coach of a very successful team, and the hockey community is relatively small and very well connected. But it is interesting going back. Again, folks, check out yesterday's show if they want to actually hear the whole thing. But the Kevin Hayes thing goes back to 2019. I do wonder if that has been the case. I mean, it shines a light on the fact that this is something that has been speculated for a long time. You've certainly seen evidence of it at times.
Sure.
But I mean, maybe the biggest concern from Jet fans is that it doesn't seem like this has gotten any better over the course of the last 3 seasons. And that is maybe the biggest organizational failure, because it affects everything, everybody else in the room. And I think it's sort of kind of creeped out in as much of that connection. Listen, wins and losses are what's going to really fire up fans. But there's a real concern, I think, I would almost offer the majority of the fan base about this. And it's not a new story, Mike.
No, it's not. And, I reported about a week ago, Huss, I think it was right after Garbage Bag Day there, that there was and we didn't know this at the time. I wasn't on the final road trip of the year, that one because the snowstorm, if you recall, canceled. I was supposed to be in Florida. Bucket list. It was going to be my
checking
bingo
off your last butt.
Right. And we now know, of course, what happened, and they lost every game on that road trip, but they really got their dinner fed to them in Florida, right? They got blown out 6-1 by the Panthers, and then they had that lead against Tampa the next night, which exploded, and they ended up getting caved in by the Lightning. I reported last week, and again, I learned about this after the fact. There was a very heated closed door players only meeting after that Tampa Bay game. And I'm told there was a lot of raised voices. It was a passionate meeting. I can't kind of tell you who was saying what and who was maybe yelling at who. What I will say, though, Haas, is it is very interesting. If you go back now, Kyle Connor, after that Tampa game, that's when he made those comments that we all went, huh, where he talked about a lack of motivation among some guys. It is interesting because I know a lot of people want to dump on Mark Scheifele.
Yeah, he wasn't there.
He wasn't even on the road trip. He didn't play that game. So I know, again, a lot of people will say, well, it's Mark Scheifele that everybody's mad at. Well, if there was a very heated players meeting that night and the Jets had just had this lead disintegrate and it was another ugly loss, I'm really curious maybe who some of the vitriol was focused at that particular night. And of course, it wasn't just that night. For the next few days, the comments started getting more and more pointed and heated publicly by players, with Kyle Connor, Pierre-Luc Dubois, and Paul Stastny being the most vocal of any Jets players. And, you know, I'm fascinated to know kind of how that meeting played out. And I don't get the sense, Huss, that anything particularly got settled. Now, to the Jets' credit, their next two games, they came out, they got shut out in New York, but I think they played a little better game. And then in Carolina, again, there was some improvements there. And then we know they came home and they won their last four. So, yeah, they didn't entirely quit on the air. I don't put much stock in the last four games. Their opponents weren't really playing for anything either. But to their credit, the Jets didn't just fold the tent.
They didn't quit.
They didn't quit. So, you know, good on them. But it is interesting. And it just speaks, again, as you pointed out, these are not new issues. You know, there was a closed door meeting just before the playoffs.
Oh, game 81, Colorado, just on that stretch when everything was falling apart. And that game, if you recall, and if I'm not mistaken, Eric Comrie started that game.
He did.
And that was one of it. At the start of this year, I cited that game and a number of us, because a lot of people were down on Eric Comrie. I'm like, can we go back and look at the way this team played in front of Eric Comrie and the few times that he started? Maybe it's time we give him a clean slate and going forward. That was the game when the first power play stayed out for the full 2 minutes and Buff smashed his stick on the ice. And then they went in. I mean, that was a team that was absolutely combusting from inside. And they never were able to get back at it, despite winning those games 3 and 4 in St. Louis and having to lead in game number 5. And as I said, winning does cure a lot of things. If Kevin Hayes doesn't pull that puck out of the what was going into the net in game 5 and they go up 3-0 and they win that game, maybe that rewrites history. But it's funny that you talk about that towards the end of the season.
Yes.
And maybe this season was a year that it should have been happening because of how disappointing the year was and they weren't going to the playoffs. But it's not unique to a team that was out of it. The same damn thing happened in 2019 when they were supposedly a legitimate Stanley Cup contender.
Well, Huss, I think we know why Kevin Hayes pulled that puck out. It's because it was the most toxic dressing room he's ever been in. He didn't want that puck to go in, no. Yeah, I mean, and all of this speaks to the enormous challenge, whether it's Barry Trotz or someone else, is going to have on their hands. Like, you're inheriting a very talented but deeply flawed hockey team with some warts that have some significant roots. And, you know, maybe some of those warts have been weeded out here in the last year or two, but clearly there are issues that remain. And, you know, again, we've talked about Paul Maurice, and whether you loved him or hated him, I think one thing Paul Maurice did a very, very good job of is managing some of the very fragile, prickly, describe them however you want, personalities in his room, and keeping a lid on the pot here from completely boiling over at times. And I do get the sense that once Paul Maurice was gone, there might have been that element a bit of the, you know, to use the old saying the inmates running the asylum a bit.
Well, I mean, listen, I might take the other side of that. I mean, I think he did that for a long time, but I think the evidence is everywhere, Mike, that it was to the detriment of the team and the organization.
Sure. Yeah, you're right. It became to the point like a parent who almost maybe spoils their children too much. It comes back to bite you, right? And in that sense, oh my goodness, what have I created? I've created a monster. And then in Paul Maurice's case, he sort of got his Frankenstein on his hands, and he's like, I'm out of here, guys. Let somebody else deal with this. So that's where, again, a guy with Barry Trotz's pedigree, we know his communication skills, are elite, with the media, with players. He knows how to manage. And Huss, you just got to look at the locker room. There were all kinds of reports of dysfunction in the Washington Capitals locker room. They've had serious issues over the years, and he found a way to get that group kind of united and all pulling in the same direction. So I think a guy like Barry Trotz, he commands attention, and he would get the attention of a room that probably needs somebody of his ilk to come in and, not swoop in and save the day, but be the kind of leader that they desperately need.
Let me ask you, speaking of leaders, about Blake Wheeler, the guy with the C on his chest. And I think it was since we have last spoke, we were talking with Murat on the program on Wednesday. And I asked Murat, if we were talking about Mark Scheifele and the potential that he'd be dealt. And I said, if that happens, where does that leave Blake Wheeler? And he had an interesting comment. And he said, in a way, it potentially might leave him somewhat on an island here. I'll put two possibilities to you, because one involves Barry Trotz, and we have to acknowledge the possibility that Barry Trotz is not the next coach of the Winnipeg Jets. If Mark Scheifele is traded and it's some other coach, what do you think that does to Wheeler's position with the Winnipeg Jets? And regardless of Scheifele being here or not, if Barry Trotz comes in, how do you think that affects the captain?
Well, let's take Blake Wheeler at his word that he wants nothing more than to win a championship. That's what he tells us. And he's repeated time after time that he knows he's running out of time. Blake Wheeler's accomplished a lot of great things in his career. He's never won a Stanley Cup. If that really is Blake Wheeler's ultimate goal, and again, I know Blake Wheeler is a fiercely competitive individual. I think we see that in the way he plays, playing through injuries, to the detriment at times of himself and even arguably his team. That's a very proud individual in Blake Wheeler. If it's all about winning, I got to think Blake Wheeler he'd be willing to do whatever it takes to get this team to where he believes it can be. And so if that means playing a lesser role, heck, if that means stepping out of the leadership group because there's others in mind that they feel, younger blood, if you will, new voices needed. You'd like to think Blake Wheeler would be fully on board with that because it fits his stated declaration of it's all about winning, it's all about the team. So I'm going to give him the benefit of the doubt and suggest that he's being very truthful when he says those things. Actions do always speak louder than words. And you'd hope that in a situation like that, things like ego and status wouldn't get in the way of doing what's ultimately best for everybody. And I think when we talk about Blake Wheeler and perhaps a new coach, there's a clean slate there. And I don't imagine a new coach gives a hoot about what Blake Wheeler has done in the past. I mean, you'd respect it, sure. The fact of the matter is, what do I have in front of me today? And what is this player going to help me do tomorrow and beyond? And I mean, we saw, I think, down the stretch, Huss, Blake Wheeler, who wasn't playing with Mark Scheifele, he was on that line with Stastny and Ehlers. That was a nice little line that they had going. They were doing some good things. Blake Wheeler looked like a guy who had an extra, giddy up.
He spoke about it afterwards. I mean, he said
did.
as disappointing as the season was, he was having a lot of fun playing with Ehlers and Stastny and would have liked maybe a few more games to do it. And I completely agree with you. I mean, he and Scheifele both had really tough starts to the season. And he took a lot of flack as, what happens when you're a captain in a Canadian city when the team's not winning and, you're not doing what is expected of you.
Right.
But I'll say this. I mean, even the biggest Wheeler, the haters or whatever you want to call them, his biggest critics, quieted down somewhat in the second half of the season because I think he did play at a pretty high level and did a lot of things that, a new head coach would want to have in the lineup.
So, again, if you're Blake Wheeler, this is the reality face you. You're getting a new coach this summer, one way or the other. It's either Barry Trotz or somebody else, but there's going to be a new voice. You either work with that person and try and accomplish a common goal, knowing if you're Blake Wheeler, you basically have 2 cracks left at this, right? That's all you got left on your contract. And Father Time is knocking on your door. And I think if you're Blake Wheeler, that reality was driven home this way in this past year in a way that hasn't in the past. He suffered a significant injury. A guy that had been injury proof was suddenly on the shelf for a couple months. So time is fleeting. You better make the most of it.
Thanks so much. This is a great conversation. And I'll look forward to reading all about the Moose and all of the trials and tribulations of what's happening with the Winnipeg Jets over the course of the next days and weeks to come in the Winnipeg Free Press. Have a great one, and maybe we'll see you at the rink tomorrow.